Hey, welcome to the Purple and Bold podcast from DNR Media as we're back post-holidays for our first episode of 2026. And as Catie just pointed out before we started recording, we haven't even done one of these since the college football playoff opening round where JMU lost at Oregon in that one. That's old news, so we won't harp too much on the actual game itself. But in the meantime, here, as we've all had our Christmas and other holidays, New Year's, everything else, JMU's kind of made that transition from Bob Chesney now at UCLA to Billy Napier running the program and rebuilding the roster for the Dukes and the coaching staff, which I think we'll start out talking a lot about the coaching staff and who's in, who's out for JMU when it comes to the coaches. And then we'll get into the roster itself as players have entered the portal. Some have gone elsewhere. Some have decided to come back to JMU. Some have entered the portal from elsewhere and are going to wind up at JMU. So plenty to talk about as the Dukes rebuild their football team. And we may even discuss a little bit basketball here later in the episode, as it's January, almost mid-January, midway through the basketball season, and football has continued to dominate the conversation around Harrisonburg. But let's start with the coaching staff for the Dukes as Billy Napier brings in some people who have ties to him previous places, some people who I'm not sure if there's like ties to him other places, and then people who are sticking around and people coming back to JMU. Let's start with that one. I think that's the one that everybody was really excited about here in the past couple days, is the announcement that JMU's new tight ends coach working for Billy Napier is Brian Shore, JMU legend, national championship quarterback, is coming back to Harrisonburg. I think it may have only been like a matter of time before he wound up on a JMU staff at some point, but it worked out this time around for him to join Billy Napier with the opening for tight ends.
Yeah, and it wasn't for a while there. It looked like it wasn't going to be, Brian Shore coming back. Reports initially said that JMU was going to hire a tight ends coach who was coming over from Tennessee. And then, things change. ODU offers the same coach, the offensive line coaching position and the run game coordinator. So he's now, at a Sun Belt rival. But when that happened, I think Shane and I exchanged a text saying, it could make sense for Brian Shore to come back. Last year was his first full season at Georgia Southern as the tight ends coach. Previously was a senior analyst with the team. But, I had just gotten home from covering the Bridgewater men's basketball game when that notification came through. And I just kind of stared at it for a second. I'm like, this is one, can't believe it's really happening. But also, like you said, it's kind of only a matter of time for it to happen. And I would say that, to see the reaction from so many people on social media, obviously, I think it's a coaching hire that people are excited to see. And I think it's a good coaching hire too. He's been on staff at Georgia Southern that, they've had some up and downs, but they've had some good offensive play. So I think he's done a good job kind of building up his coaching resume to this point so far in his career. And, I think it's probably one that both sides are very excited to have him back in Harrisonburg.
Yeah, you talk about it being a little bit up and down at Georgia Southern since Shore has been there. Clay Helton's taken some heat as the head coach there, but nobody's knocked them for their passing game and whatever role the tight ends play in that. And I would think Shore, as a former quarterback, his thoughts on offense in general were probably discussed amongst that staff. This is kind of, you and I, we follow football really in depth. It's not that weird for us to see somebody who didn't play the position of tight end to get into the business as a tight ends coach. But I'll address that because it was asked to me at the JMU men's basketball game when that news came out, and there were still some people kind of hanging around. It was asked to me by somebody who's not as well versed on football. It was he was a quarterback, so he's going to coach tight ends. So just to say that I don't think this is not a weird career path at all for somebody of his background to get into offensive coaching, maybe not necessarily the position that he's known for as a legendary JMU player.
Yeah, I told my mom yesterday, I was on the phone with her. I was like, and I tell her about work all the time and what kind of what's going on in my job. And I was like, well, did you see who JMU hired yesterday. And she's like, no, who? And I said, Brian Shore is tight ends coach. And that was her first reaction. She's like, he wasn't a tight end. Because again, like Brian Shore was the quarterback my freshman and sophomore year. So my parents had started following JMU football at that point. And it's one of those, like, I think back to kind of his play as a quarterback and what JMU's offense was doing back then. I know if people follow me on Twitter, I probably tweet about the tight end pop pass at least 5 times a season, probably more. And that was a play that was often used with Brian Shore at quarterback. Like, he had a great connection with the tight ends at JMU. So it honestly, like you said, it does kind of translate well with how he played. And I mean, you look at this previous staff that is now kind of outgoing. Justin Harper in his time, yes, he was coaching wide receivers at JMU, but he's coached tight ends before. They coach different positions than what they necessarily played. You look at Indiana's success right now, and their running back coach was a wide receiver at JMU. So there is that kind of push and pull on where people coach and what they played. But I think Brian Shore obviously knows an offense well with his history as a quarterback. And I think there's probably no big concern with him coaching tight ends.
Yeah, and like we said, this is going to be an exciting one for everybody. I think everybody was hoping that someday he would end up back in Harrisonburg, and it seemed like it was likely, whether it be this staff or down the line, that that could happen. But it is happening now, and it speaks to, I think, what Billy Napier is doing with the staff overall. He's getting some guys. He is keeping some guys who know JMU and know this area and the school and what's needed here. Dave Plungus is sticking around. Like Shore, it makes a ton of sense for him. His wife joined the volleyball staff last year, so I think their family just wanted to be around here. So you got another guy who has, some knowledge of what's happening here at JMU. With Shore, you get a guy who knows the Sun Belt. If he hasn't been at JMU, he's been working at Georgia Southern. He knows the Sun Belt. There's other guys joining the staff who are like that. And then there's some others in roles that are interesting, like, going to Michigan to get some guys in nutrition and strength and conditioning, things like that. Just what's your kind of overall view of how the staff's coming together and what each person kind of brings?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting staff. And I think we've seen him Billy Napier place emphasis on certain areas. You said Dave Plungus sticking around, and he's getting that slight promotion where he's going to be an assistant head coach now. That's a different tag than what he had last year, and he's going to be working specifically with the outside linebackers. You have Kyle Barnes sticking around from the previous staff, and they're moving him from nickels to corners. And both of those coaches, when I talk to recruits, when I talk to guys on the team, they are guys that constantly get praised. I mean, Trent Hendrick all last year talked about how much he loved playing for Dave Plungus. When it was announced that he was sticking around and he was being retained on staff, one of the incoming commits, Josiah Perry, he's going to be a freshman. He was very, very excited to see that Plungus was still going to be on this staff. So I think Billy Napier has done a good job of making sure guys are being hired, that there is that prior relationship with some of these players, because it helps a recruiting class stick together. Obviously, in a really weird time where signing day came before there was even an announcement on who the coach was going to be. But then you look at some of these guys, they're bringing in staff members that have experience, like you said, at Michigan, that are in the Power 4 ranks. Napier himself obviously is coming from the Power 4 and bringing several of his guys with him, but he has done a good job of adding guys to his staff that have just Group of 5 level experience, so they kind of understand this landscape of college football. And he kind of said it after his introductory press conference to all of us that, he's made more money in his life than he could have ever imagined that he could have made. And he's turned down more money in order to kind of spread it out and add some positions that maybe what they weren't here before. And I think you're seeing that now with some of the emphasis that they're putting on recruiting and positions that they have brought in guys to just handle the recruiting side of all of it. So I think that has kind of been a heavy emphasis for Napier. And that was something he had also said, was that, he likes high school recruiting. Obviously, you have to recruit the portal nowadays, but I think he's building a really good staff that's going to be able to identify some really, really good high school talent.
Yeah, I think even initially before, while Bob Chesney was still here and things, and Jamie was getting ready for a game and everything, you saw initially a lot of like class of 27 recruits and everything were getting their offers and getting their interest from JMU. So like you said, jumping right into high school, he's probably going to have to use the portal to build this initial team, especially where you lose players with a coaching search, and you got to have some veterans that are ready to step in right away. But like you said too, we can kind of get into like what Napier taking less money means for the roster and everything as a whole as we get into like the players that are here. But I do find it interesting that the player personnel department seems to have grown a lot as Napier gets in here. Jacob LaFrance has taken over that part of the department. We see Matt Transu go into UCLA. I wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen with his role when LaFrance was hired, because he had been a guy who had stuck through, was originally here with Signetti and then stayed on. I wasn't sure what his ideal path was going to be, but he's going to UCLA too. So congrats to him. But, they're bringing in a lot of guys in that area to do the evaluations, I think, set up the visits, do all the kind of like legwork it takes for bringing in both high school and portal players. What do you think it means that there's that many more personnel positions just out here now?
I mean, like you said, that was one of the first things I noticed about his staff were these guys that he was bringing in. And I feel like some of those player personnel hires were the first ones that were reported. You were hearing those before, you heard about a defensive line coach or a linebackers coach. I would say that is Napier making sure that he is putting himself and his staff in this program in the best position to be successful in kind of this modern era of college football. I think he had said it multiple times too, that when he left Louisiana for Florida, I think he liked coaching at the Group of Five, but he was very skeptical of what it would become with the transfer portal and how it was going. So now that he is back at the Group of Five level, I think he is trying to make sure that all of their bases are covered to make sure that they're not missing something in terms of if it's a really talented player that hits the portal, that, they have these player personnel people who can handle, watching all of that film, finding those people, locating the talent, but even making sure that they're retaining and bringing guys back that are already on the roster that can help this team going forward. I think it's right now Napier making sure that the player personnel department is staffed and ready to go, is him making sure that this program is kind of capable of handling what this modern era of college football has become.
Yeah, and as we kind of like get into the individuals that JMU has now gotten commitments from and signed, it's notable that because of the calendar, the portal opens a little bit earlier for the non-Division I guys, and those personnel people that we're talking about, they had to be working hard. They were out there like looking, and JMU offers and gets commitments from several Division II players coming up, which is a little bit new, but I think just we're in an era where talent is spread out all over the place, and the really good players at the Division II level can play at the Division I level. But they didn't find these guys just by like turning on ESPN one Saturday and like, oh, their game's on TV. You got to really go out and work and figure out and get the tape and talk to their coaches and everything else to know who these guys are and whether they can make that transition. So I think that was like interesting. As the very first weeks that they're on the job, those are the first players you can look at. They're the first players you can talk to. They're the first ones into the portal. And JMU seemed to really jump on some of those Division II guys.
Yeah, they did. And that's who you're seeing commit right now, or for the most part, some Division II guys, Division III. And, there are probably going to be fans out there that are worried, like, well, why is JMU just getting D2 guys? Why aren't there maybe some splashier commitments? And like you said, and I think we've talked about it on past episodes, I think ever since COVID, there has been such a saturation of talent that you are seeing really talented football players kind of end up at the Division II level, at the Division III level, at the FCS level, just because of how much COVID impacted their high school recruiting. And I think, you look at some of the guys that were big contributors last year, especially on like the offensive side of the ball, they were guys who didn't get heavily recruited out of high school because, they didn't have a senior season or something like that. So I think you're still kind of seeing that aspect play out in college football right now, where JMU is capable of finding these talented players that maybe went under the radar just because their recruitment wasn't as crazy or as sought after as some of these P4 players.
Yeah, that's a really good point that we are still seeing the effects of COVID, but also too, like we're in the house settlement era too, where and the SEC is going back to like 120 man rosters, but last year basically everybody went from like having 120 to 140 players counting their walk-ons to Division One rosters. The FBS rosters were basically 105 players, so like that's just less people playing Division One football and playing in the SEC and playing in the Sun Belt or whatever league. So where did those guys go? Like they were probably playing FCS and Division Two and places here in the past year. So I think just in general, looking at a Division Two player now and looking at somebody 10 years ago is a completely different ballgame. Like last year or 10 years ago, there was probably a handful of guys playing Division II football who could come in and really make a difference at this level. And now there's a lot. And, the guy, like you said, there's probably fans who say like, oh, they signed somebody from West Florida or University of Indianapolis or all these programs that they don't know very well. But look at who else was recruiting them. Like these guys were taking visits to JMU and Power 4 programs and other, really good group of 6 programs. So, the coaches are seeing something out of these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it's just there are so many talented players. And I think, like you said, the roster limits dropping down. There are just so many talented players that just find themselves in a sticky situation where they have to go play football or they want to go play football, but they have to go take an offer where it comes. And, some of these guys maybe are dropping down to D2 so they can get that playing time right away to build up their stats and add film and get that recognition eventually. But I think you're still seeing some talented names. And now that the portal has been open for FCS and FBS players for, just over a week now, I think you're starting to see some of those offers come through and starting to see some of those commitments come through where it's going to be a balance of guys that are coming up from the Division II level and also recruits coming in that are going to be, FCS players, fellow G5 players, even some Power 4 players are committing in a wide receiver, from LSU. JMU's covering their bases and making sure that they're recruiting everybody, not just kind of that small section that we saw over the last month from the Division II level.
Yeah, like you said, it's a cross section of everywhere. So that said, who are some of the more intriguing guys that you've seen JMU get commitments from, or they're announcing signings here today for a lot of them. So who are the most intriguing incoming players that you've seen as you've either looked them up or talked to a few of them?
Yeah, I'll start with the 2 that I've talked to. It's actually been a little weird. I was telling our boss yesterday that this year it's been harder to get them to follow me back on Twitter. So like some of them aren't seeing the messages that I'm sending asking to talk. But so far I've talked to Seth Cromwell, who's the running back, who's coming from Northern Arizona, but was previously at Western Missouri State. And I've also talked to Arrington Maiden, who's the quarterback coming over from Memphis. Cromwell was the first one I talked to, and I actually was really impressed kind of with his production as he kind of made those rounds coming up. And he was one that coming out of high school, the offers weren't there. Missouri Western State gave him an opportunity. He went, he produced well, transfers into the FCS, plays at Northern Arizona. And, from what I was able to find, just listening to, I found a tweet from his former coach at NAU who said he's one of those best guy on and off the field, someone that is going to play super hard. So, and he even told me that he is a violent runner when he gets the ball in his hand, and he will try and run some people over if needed. So that should be a pretty exciting addition for the JMU fans who are looking at the running back room now that, Wayne Knight has made his way out to the West Coast, and JMU's looking at returning pretty much only George Pettaway and a couple freshmen. And then talked with Arrington Maiden earlier today, and I think he's ready to go. I've never really sat down with an interview and I would ask him one question and he just started breaking down like life film. It almost seemed like at times I asked about how he got involved in football as a kid, and all of a sudden he's talking about how many yards he threw in high school. And, he even did it when I asked about ending up at Memphis. He started talking about games that he played really well, how he thought he performed. So definitely an eager kid who's excited about his opportunity. And he told me that, he struggled leaving JMU after his visit because he didn't really want to leave. He liked it right away, saw himself playing at James Madison, and he had a visit right after. And he's like, he said he knew he had to leave out because it was the respectful thing to do, to go on that visit that he had already committed to. But it was one of those that he knew that he wanted to play at JMU and he wanted to play for Billy Napier.
Yeah, we'll circle back to I think defensive line in particular, because that's where JMU really got started with those portal guys. But let's talk about the quarterback position, because you just talked about Maiden, what he's going to bring here. But we can look at who's coming back for JMU. Obviously you talked about Cromwell too. They're going to have at least a little bit of depth at running back with him and George Pettaway coming back. But let's talk about the quarterback position, because JMU did, it appears, retain Cam Coleman and Evans at that position, guys who have a little bit of college experience. So, obviously probably a little too early to tell, but what's your kind of gut feeling about where things stand at quarterback? And, is it going to be a completely open competition going into the spring?
I mean, I think it's obviously going to be an open competition, especially when you have a new coach coming in and you don't have the returner from last year back. So I think it's definitely going to be an open competition. I think it's hard to ignore what Camden Coleman can bring in terms of experience and age. I think Camden Coleman is an extremely talented quarterback who has already proven to be a competent and good starter who can handle that kind of pressure that it takes. And, he's going to be the older guy in the room when it comes down to Maiden and JC Evans. Obviously, you can make the argument that this coaching staff went out and got Arrington Maiden, and so maybe that's someone that they want to be a starting quarterback. But I think it's something that it's going to play out in the spring and into the fall of who is going to be the starter, because I really do see it being a competition. I think maybe my gut reaction is Camden Coleman, just because he's probably who I've seen throw around the ball the most just from practices. And obviously I think JC Evans has continued to get better and better the more he's been around the college game. But I do think it's kind of hard to ignore the resume that Camden Coleman has going into the spring.
Yeah, I would think that, going into the spring, he'd be probably, the guy takes the first snap when it comes to getting out there, just because, like you said, he is experienced. He started games. It was at the FCS level, but he started a lot of games in his career. And if you want a guy who is already there, already in the locker room, is already meeting with those coaches and everything right now, you would think it would be kind of like you said, open competition, but somebody's got to go out there and take the first snap. And I would think he'd maybe be in position to kind of be the leader of the room to start out with. Like I said, let's talk a little bit about defensive line, because that's where things seem to have been going really well for your JMU here in the portal, whether it be guys they brought in or, in a case, a guy that they ended up pulling out of the portal and getting to stick around JMU. So as teams probably want to build in the trenches and start from there, let's talk a little bit about what they're going to look like up front on defense.
I mean, they've gotten the benefit of Michael McMullen and Amar Thomas both coming out of the portal. Before that even happened, they were offering some big guys up front to come in, and I'm talking big guys from the Division II level. Usually you hear that one of the reasons these guys are at the Division II level is maybe they don't have the size. That's not the case necessarily for what Napier and his staff have found in the portal. They have found some big guys up front that can, really play well in the trenches. And then to get Amar Thomas and Michael McMullen back, I think that is such an added benefit that cannot be understated, because those two really grew into the season. They both really started to play much, much better as the year went on. And I think those are two good pieces to build around on the defensive line. But I think on top of that, even if you take a step back and look at the linebacker position and the fact that Napier has been able to retain Gannon Weathersby, who played a lot of snaps next to Trent Hendrick last year. I think this defensive front is shaping up to be a very, very good and very talented group that has some experience. And I know that highlights were surfacing of one of Rasheed Lovelace, of one of the Division II guys that committed. Big man pick six. I feel like any football fan should be excited when they see a guy that's a nose tackle taking a pick six. I think it's a very exciting group. And I know when I saw that, highlight, I think that maybe if I was a coach, I probably would have offered just on that alone.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit too about those guys coming out of the portal. And I know like once the season ended, some people started announcing their intention to enter the portal. We both heard like, yeah, they're still working on, trying to retain some of these guys. And even if they're saying they're going to be in the portal, coaching staff's going to continue to talk to them. I think fans in particular were probably skeptical that they would be successful in that. And I too didn't really know like how well that would go. To see two guys of that caliber on the defensive line, to see Braden Wisłowski, a wide receiver who finished the year really strong, to see some of these players are coming out of the portal. They had opportunities. Wisłowski, I think, visited Oklahoma State and is still coming back to JMU. I think what's that say? I think one, we don't really know about like what the financial component of this is, but it does seem to indicate JMU is being competitive in that regard. But two, like what's to say about the coaching staff and the personnel staff that we talked about, that they are convincing these guys that this is the place they want to stay?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things first is it's different than it was 2 years ago where, Chesney rightfully so laid down the line of like, hey, if you enter the portal, you're gone. If you leave, you leave, because they need to be in a position that they know who they need to go out and recruit. So it's a little bit different now where Napier is obviously allowing these guys to kind of test the market, see what's out there, and then still make that decision in the end if it's good for them to come back. And like you said, we've seen it with Wisłowski and, Amar Thomas and Michael McMullen. I don't think anybody can fault these guys for trying to see what is out there, especially being a team that just played in the college football playoff. I think they've earned that opportunity to kind of test the market, but I do think it says a lot that, they still, at the end of the day, want to come back and play at JMU, because they probably all have had at least some kind of offer out there from other teams. Obviously, like you said, we don't know the money aspect of it, so we don't know if they're not getting offered as much money as they want, if it's not as much compared to what JMU may give them. But I think there is still that comfort of coming back to a place that, I mean, even Amar Thomas, when he shared that he was coming back, he joked that like these other programs don't even have streamers. So I think it was one of those things where he knew what he had at JMU, and he knew it was something that he liked and he fit the team well. And so I think it is a bit of a comfort, even under a new coaching staff, coming back to a program where he knows that he has liked it over the last several of years.
Yeah. And, that's a lot that we kind of tried to digest when it comes to the portal here. By the time we sit down and do this again next week, I'm sure we'll start to probably have like at least some idea how the entire roster is shaping up. It won't be complete, but I think it's going to continue to be like a really busy week or so of recruiting for JMU. Before we go, we'll just I
was going to say, everything we've seen so far has almost kind of been on the defensive side of the ball. There have been a couple offensive additions in terms of, Cromwell, Maiden, adding the wide receiver away from LSU. But I do think over the next week or so, we're going to start seeing a little bit more action on the offensive side of the ball, and commitment wise. And there are some talented players out there. So like you said, when we sit down next time to talk about this, we may be able to focus even more on the offensive side of the ball and who JMU is possibly bringing in.
Yeah, and we'll see if when we come back next week, if we'll have a little more optimistic view of basketball for JMU. Before we go, it's been up and down for both hoops teams with the Dukes. It's still a really good season for the JMU women, but they go and they drop one on the road to a Georgia Southern team that's good. That's a top 100 team in the conference. That's a tough place to play on the road. JMU teams across the board, not just women's basketball, have struggled anytime they've gone down to Statesboro, it seems like. So they dropped that one after really dominating a couple teams at home for women's basketball. They're still in pretty good shape, but 2 Sun Belt losses means that they've got to play well here the rest of the way to win the regular season in the Sun Belt. I think they still have a really good shot to do that, but not necessarily the start to conference play that Sean O'Regan would have liked, dropping a couple road games. And on the men's side, it's really been inconsistent for the JMU men. They go on the road, win a quality good game against a pretty good Arkansas State team that's now 3-1 in conference play. They win that one on the road, and then they come home and fall behind Marshall and never able to come all the way back in that one. Dropped their first home game, but sit at 8-8 and 1-3 in the Sun Belt. I'd say a little bit disappointing for the JMU men's basketball team where they are right now, keeping in mind that around this time last year, they went and reeled off 10 straight wins to get into the race and get a share of the conference title. But I don't blame anybody if they've watched this team play and they just don't see that happening this time around for the JMU men.
Yeah, I haven't even made it out to a men's game yet. Football goes to the college football playoff and all of a sudden that's taking up all of my time. But it's, I just on Wednesday watching, I had your Twitter notifications on because I was sitting at Bridgewater covering a men's game there. And I just following both the men's and women's scores. It's one of those where you're like, oh, it's going to be one of those nights in conference play for James Madison. That said, the Bridgewater men's game was great. It was a very great game on Wednesday night, so I can't complain about what I was covering. But it's one of those where I think you're starting to see some people maybe get a little antsy with how these games are going, and they're not going as maybe they would have gone 2 years ago. But I think like we always say, January into February is always the craziest time for college basketball, and maybe want to see it turn around here in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, we spent so much time just now talking about personnel stuff when it comes to football, and it's really similar for basketball, trying to figure that out, especially on the men's side where it can be a little harder to retain players. And I don't know. I feel like, I don't think anybody on the coaching staff necessarily is going to admit this, but I think in some ways JMU was hoping that this could be like a transition year basketball. They would continue to compete for the championship in the Sun Belt, and they still have a chance to do that. But it just hasn't gelled quite as much as they hoped. And I think, the real strategy probably for the team and the program right now is to try to retain some of these younger guys that they did get out of the portal last year and just have 3 or 4 or 5 guys coming back next year, which the program just hasn't had in a couple of years. And you look at Marshall, who beat JMU. You look at Troy, who's up there in it. They bring back a couple guys who weren't superstars last year, but they're on the roster again this year, and they're putting up big numbers, whether it be a Jalen Spear at Marshall or, Victor Valdez at Troy. So I think, JMU, you kind of got to take it a little bit year by year, not get too down on the program as a whole if you're the fan base, and hope you retain some players and are able to kind of build something after 2 years of Preston Spradlin having to kind of completely rebuild the roster.
Yeah, I mean, like we talked about it so much in the past with, like Chesney having to rebuild the roster his first year in Harrisonburg, and, how difficult that is to have guys go out and be competitive when you're making and building all of these new connections. But I feel like even in some capacity, when you add 60 new players on a football team, in my brain, that still seems a little bit easier than completely rebuilding a basketball lineup. Like football, you have guys, you have more of an opportunity to retain guys just because of how big the rosters are. With basketball, when you're rebuilding pretty much your entire starting lineup, that just seems almost like one of those things where it's hard to expect teams to win as many games as you want them to, just because that continuity in basketball just seems maybe a little bit, it almost seems like it has a little bit bigger of an impact than it does in football.
I think it does. And, you see it on the women's side where it's been easier for JMU to retain really good players. And, they have 4 players coming back from last year, 4 or 5, like depending on how you want to look at it, who was a significant player last year. But, they had that base to build on, and they end up having a really good non-conference and, net rankings in the top 60 and doing pretty well with that program. And I really do think that that's what you want to see from the men is regardless of how this year ends up turning out, if they go on and win 20 games from here, or if it continues to be a struggle around 500, if you can keep a couple guys around the program for next year, that's how you begin to kind of build it. And we'll see how that ends up going. But, in the meantime, they do have a chance to turn this around and win a couple games. And they play ODU tomorrow. Get a chance to get that one back after dropping one on the road to them. So big rivalry game that we'll see if they end up having a little bit better crowd than they did for the one against Marshall on Saturday. But in the meantime, like I said, we'll be back sometime next week to discuss more basketball results and definitely more transfer portal results for football, because we're going to see more and more of that surely in the next week. So in the meantime, you've been listening to Purple and Bold from the Daily News Record and DNR Media, our podcast channel. Look for us, like and subscribe everywhere that you listen, including YouTube. So thanks for tuning in.